only on Bloomberg Quint.
In April, the Reserve Bank of India told payment firms that they must store their data locally. It gave these firms about 6 months and set a deadline of the 15th of October to comply with these regulations. That deadline is now here, and despite intense lobbying, the Reserve Bank of India has stuck to its stance. Is it justified in this stance, and what are the implications for payment firms once these new rules kick in? Joining us to talk about that is R. Gandhi, former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, and Mr. AP Hota, former Chief of the National Payments Corporation. Both of them the best experts in banking technology that are available to speak right now. So thank you both very much for joining us here on this discussion. Mr. Gandhi, I'm going to start with you, but for our viewers' sake, a small disclosure, Mr. Gandhi is also an advisor to Paytm now. But Mr. Gandhi, let me ask you, is the RBI justified in holding on to its stance that we want data stored only locally? As you're well aware, there's been intense lobbying suggesting that at least data mirroring should be allowed and an insistence of storing only in India should not be made.
See, first of all, regulatory policies are not based on lobbying or whatever. The regulator has given us certain instructions, and the regulated entities will have to comply with that. If they have problem, of course, they have the right to represent and discuss with the regulator, bring forth whatever might be the problem. But their efforts, they should show in on the ground that they have made efforts to comply. If instead of making an efforts to comply, simply lobbying for changing the regulation, and later on around the deadline, if they would say that the time is insufficient for us to comply now, that argument will not be acceptable. A country has, each jurisdiction has taken certain decision based on their respective jurisdiction's own requirements and compulsions. On that basis, any commercial entity that would operate will have to operate within the law of that respective countries, respective jurisdiction. One cannot say that I am operating this way in another jurisdiction, in my own jurisdiction. The same way I should be allowed to operate in in your jurisdiction also. That argument will not be able to be accepted. So that would be my initial reaction, that for whatever reason, the regulator has come to this conclusion that data will have to be retained in within its jurisdiction. Then the regulated entities will have to comply with that requirement only. I will not be able to accept the argument that 6 months of lobbying, and at this point in time when it is not granted, they say time is insufficient for us to comply. That is difficult to accept.
Spoken like a former regulator, Mr. Gandhi. Let me put that question to Mr. Hota as well. Mr. Hota, and let me get into the conceptual.
Hold on. My own personal view is different. Okay, but today the regulation stands this way, so one has to comply with that.
Okay, and I'm going to come to your personal view, but I'll start with Mr. Hota. Mr. Hota, you know, as you have seen the payment system grow, obviously complexities have come in. The regulator is justified in moving with those changing times. But did you see enough merit in their argument that data has to be stored only in India? Because I think a lot of people said if the RBI's jurisdiction is supervisory, then having a copy of the data in India should be enough, Mr. Hota.
The justification given by Reserve Bank in the directive itself is to have unfettered access to supervisory access to payments data. So the question is whether unfettered supervisory access to data would be possible in any alternative way. I believe the definition of unfettered access to supervisory data, that itself is not very clear. If the unfettered supervisory data is just asking for, you ask for information and it should be supplied within 24 hours or 36 hours, this is one way of defining. Another way is, the content of the data, the data to be churned out and different analytics to be generated, that ability may not be there if the data is kept outside. So possibly the rationale for the central bank is, if the data is within the country, it would not only have the easy access to data and facilitate the law enforcement agencies, but it would also prevent misuse of data or monetization of data outside the country. And as you know, in many countries in the world, very clearly Russia, China, and quite a few countries, they have they have either implemented or are in the process of implementing. The question is, how do we implement? Whether 6 months is adequate. In my opinion, 6 months is not adequate. In fact, from my experience shows that in fact it should have been given by way of a roadmap. So in the context of growing nationalism, if even for countries like US, as a principle, as an objective, I suppose there cannot be any question, and this has been endorsed even by Sri Krishna Committee and also the Data Protection Bill. The Data Protection Bill also empowers the central government to have create a data localization regulations and rules. So about whether regulator is justified, regulator is justified. Whether the timeline is justified, absolutely not, because my experience shows it would require, at least for the card companies like Visa and MasterCard, going by my experience of setting up of RuPay system in India, it would require about 3 years. So a 3-year roadmap would have been given, and possibly the data mirroring can be the step 1 that can really happen in immediate term, and that is not much of a challenge. And but a lot of rules would have to be created if you really go for the data mirroring rules, because you don't know whether the data has been fully mirrored or not. So a lot of work is required to be done. Okay. So roadmap for 3 years, and a lot of plans for building rules, regulations for the 3-year period should have been the right approach.
Okay, let me put that question to Mr. Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi, you said your personal view was different. Can I request you to detail that view, both in the concept that the RBI is pursuing and, as Mr. Hota was saying, in the practicality of it?
Yeah, I agree with Hota in the point that my personal view, of course, earlier also I have expressed that data mirroring could have been a sufficient requirement. But whatever, finally, it is not the individual view that will prevail. It is the institution's view. The regulator has come to this conclusion, so that's why it has to be complied with. Number 1. Number 2, yes, in terms of timing, yes, that is where I said that the participants, the regulators, should have gone to the Reserve Bank and said that we need time to implement. First, they have to admit that we will comply. Then in the process of complying, they can present very clearly that this will need this much of time. So a roadmap or when the milestone-based compliance, that could have been proposed. But probably the regulator would have accepted that reality and given adequate time. Instead, all of them were trying to argue that this is not required at all. This regulation should be changed, instead of making an effort to comply. That is where I have a difference of opinion with the market participant, that they should have first accepted the regulation. Yes, we'll comply, and for that compliance we need certain infrastructure to be created, certain action to be done that involve time. That's the way the discussion should have been gone on, instead of totally negating the regulation.
Mr. Gandhi, you agree with Mr. Hota that you would have probably needed almost a 3-year period to comply with this, particularly, and I'm going to center the focus on card companies, sheer volume of transactions and legacy systems that they have. Is it justified for at least the card companies to ask for more time?
See, the point is that they have already complied with that kind of requirement in certain jurisdiction. So they have that experience, how long it took for that to happen. That is what they should have presented with the facts, that this is what it involves. These are the steps that need to be taken. Each step requires this much time. That kind of proffering, had it been there, it would have helped in deciding whether adequate additional time has to be given or not. Instead, if they would say that we don't want to comply this requirement at all, that is where the difference comes. Yes, as Hota says, it would have taken 3 years because he has that experience of RuPay. So from that, he is drawing certain conclusion. Possibly that is 3 years or 1 year. That depends upon how they present the technical difficulties and how it can be quickened. Those kind of discussions should have taken place.
Mr. Hota, just share your experience on the card front in particular. Firstly, we don't know what the RBI will do if these card companies are non-compliant as of the deadline. We are assuming that there will be no dramatic move like, impairment of transactions, etc. At most, there could be perhaps monetary penalties or restrictions on adding new cards or something like that if they are non-compliant. But from there on, if they say that, okay, we are now going to comply, can you help us understand how complex it will be for them?
In fact, particularly for the card payment systems, the system is quite complex. They have their processing centers currently outside the country in US, and the processing takes and quite a few other geography also, because they do the processing in a very sophisticated manner to see that the transaction is processed within a few seconds. So very sophisticated systems have been put in place. And if we want that data to reside only in India, the only word only is very important, only in India, that means they will have to replicate a lot of processes in India. They will have to take up the data center, put the systems in operations, and migrate the systems. And migration of the processing system is also not an easy job, because I am telling out of my experience, migrating from one switch to another switch, it's also it takes time. Of course, the technology is moving pretty fast. The time that I said 3 years is the one in the conventional way. I'm not sure whether there are more sophisticated technology available so that it can be done in much quicker pace. But along with the transaction processing, a lot of validation goes, particularly for fraud prevention and analytics. And for these things to be done, the analysis to be done on the fly, means as the transaction is happening, analysis of the transaction is done and a fraud score is developed. That requires another engine to be put in place. So it is quite costly, but cost is not the consideration. They are companies with deep pockets, money is there, but it is a question of time. So possibly that is why I'm saying the intermediate step of data mirroring could have been the right one, with the caveat that when they mirror the data, they must ensure that the full trail of the transactions is also copied. So the data mirroring, in fact, that definition itself is subject to debate, and possibly the regulator, card companies, and the experts can sit together and define the data mirroring and work out a timeline, and thereafter, in slow and gradual way, possibly it can move. But once again I would reiterate, obviously I do not know, in some literature I see that many countries are going for data localization or creating the data borders. It is creating the data borders, also with an objective that digital infrastructure should get developed within the country, and India being a big market, creating such a roadmap for digital infrastructure for all major companies operating in India is not a bad idea. So that way there is, I have no question on the Reserve Bank rationale, but the roadmap is what all is required, and also the regulators, payment system regulator in the respective countries, particularly US, need to be consulted, so that when data mirroring and data sharing takes place, there should not be any objection coming at the last moment, because the company might say yes, we will supply the data, but at last moment there could be compulsions.
Okay.
So
let me put that question to Mr. Gandhi as well.
Dialogue with the regulators is also necessary.
Let me put that question to Mr. Gandhi. And Mr. Gandhi, Mr. Hota brought the debate down to what has been at the backdrop. For some reason, this has become a global versus local debate. So even in the implementation, one is constantly hearing that the local players are in a position or willing to comply, but the global players are not. Surely that's not the right way to look at this debate. Although, as Mr. Hota said, there is an element of, sort of sovereignty of data, which is a much larger debate.
See, localization of data, it is nothing new in the sense that there are many jurisdictions, including the US and Europe. They have the requirement that a bank will have to operate only as a wholly owned subsidiary. One cannot operate as a branch in their respective jurisdiction. So localization of operations, localization of data, or localization of incorporation, that is the norm in many jurisdictions. So on that, one cannot be faulted whether India has taken this stance with reference to this, and America has taken a stance with reference to something else. That cannot be, because everything ultimately, any commercial entity will have to operate within the rules, regulations, and the law of the respective jurisdiction where they want to operate. That is given. That on that. Now, if there is any inter-regulatory issues, in the sense that one regulator asks for certain thing, whereas the other regulator prohibits that. If that is a kind of stalemate which is foreseen, then obviously the respective regulators, they have their own platforms to discuss among themselves, and they have bilateral arrangements also for bank supervision. The Reserve Bank and many jurisdictions have signed with one another MOUs. So those kind of platform can be definitely utilized for resolving that kind of stalemate kind of issues. So if it comes to that, yes, there are opportunities, there are methods, there are platforms through which such questions can be addressed. So I don't think that will be a problem in the sense it has to be recognized. That is the point which this the multinational companies, they have to bring forth what problem they face in terms of complying with the local regulation. That if their own home country regulator has prescribed something else, that has to be brought forth. That should be told to the current regulator here. Then the host country can be engaged with the discussions.
Okay. Let me just, bring the conversation down to a slightly more consumer level, both Mr. Gandhi and Mr. Hota. Mr. Gandhi, one is assuming that the RBI won't take measures like, impinging on the transactions that are continuing if these companies are non-compliant. I don't think the RBI would do something like that, but perhaps some strictures would be put in place, which could mean higher costs for these companies, which would get passed on to the consumer. How does one understand what this is going to mean for the consumer, Mr. Gandhi?
Yeah, enforcement will always have several considerations before finalizing the regulatory enforcement actions. So by the customer convenience certainly will be factored in by the regulator before passing on any final penalty. There will be time for readjustment. There will be grandfathering. These are all the standard tools with which legacy issues can be resolved by the regulator while taking enforcement actions. So we cannot predict the mind of the regulator what exact penalty or punishment it will give for non-compliance. But it is fair to expect that the customers will not be affected unduly. The burden of the penalty will be squarely on the service provider rather than on the customer.
Hota, your view on that, and also if I could broaden the question into innovation again. These are arguments coming from the industry, so I understand that there are vested interests here. But some of the people who were in the process of developing new payment products saying that this could push back that innovation. I'll name one particular product, not to ask you specifically about that, but for instance, WhatsApp is saying that we would have had this payment service which could have benefited millions of customers, but now it's getting pushed back, etc. Is there a balance? Is there an implication for both costing and for innovation, Mr. Hota?
I do not think there is any such argument, and if the payment service provider, service provider who are affected are arguing that way, I do not agree with that. I suppose the Reserve Bank of India is a very progressive regulator, and they would not like the consumer to get affected. I fully endorse Mr. Gandhi's point of view that the burden of compliance will come only to the companies and not to the consumers. And I do not think the regulator in India will take steps the way some countries have taken some steps, thereby the consumers not being able to really transact their cards of that type. I suppose senior officials of RBI have indicated very clearly that consumer would remain unaffected, and I believe that it would remain unaffected. And as far as the innovations part is concerned, I do not think. Rather, this kind of regulation which is coming, that would push them to think innovative so far as the technology implementation is concerned. Is it possible to process and at the same time the data being stored only in India? Possibly the technology option has, they might have, definitely the card companies would have looked at it. It would require a big architectural change, but some solution might emerge, and in response to this regulatory move, possibly low-cost solution can also get developed. So it is not taking away the innovation in any way. One can argue that, well, for some time possibly banks would think in terms of instead of issuing Visa and MasterCard, they will think seriously about issuing RuPay card, which will really go unaffected, or think of domestic payment systems instead of the payment systems being run by the foreign companies. They might think some way, but the multinational companies are also pretty smart and they have very agile technology. They can, I suppose, they come back once they create the mindset that they will have to comply with that. I suppose I would also urge the companies who think that they are getting victimized and affected to think in an innovative way and respond very positively. That would be good for India and good for them as well, that in response to this regulation they can also get low-cost solution, low-cost technology, because if they would like to replicate the way the transaction processing system, the way they are doing in the global system, it would be very cost, it would be very, very prohibitive. They would definitely come out with very innovative technology.
So, Mr. Hota, just to close that loop, so there is a possibility that there would be higher costs involved in the interim, and that would get passed on to customers in terms of, transaction costs, fees, etc.
But I don't think the companies would be able to pass on the cost to the customers, and customers in India are so sensitive to pricing, they would immediately shift. I do not think the card companies will change the pricing, but and besides that, most of the prices are also fixed at the central level, either by banks themselves or by the regulator itself. Like MDR is fixed by the regulator. These UPI and IMPS transaction fixed by the regulator, and quite a few many of the transaction processing comes so much free these days to the customers, and alternatives are available so much that I don't think companies would think of changing the price structure. They would try to adjust themselves by adopting new technology, which is low-cost technology. That is my hunch.
All right. So it looks like both Mr. Gandhi and Mr. Hota agree that the customer would not be inconvenienced. Companies would, but that's okay. They have to deal with the regulations, as Mr. Gandhi said. Thanks so much, Mr. Gandhi, Mr. Hota, for joining us on this discussion. That's the localization of data rule that the RBI first introduced in April, gave a deadline of October 15 for compliance. That deadline is now here. Thanks so much for watching Bloomberg Quint.